March 15, 1945. The North Atlantic crossing had taken 11 days, 11 days of cramped quarters below deck, stale bread, and thin soup that barely kept hunger at bay. Greta Reinhardt pressed her face against the small porthole, watching the American coastline emerge through the morning fog like a promise she had been taught never to believe. She was 23 years old, a former radio operator for the Wehrmacht, and everything she knew about America came from the carefully crafted newsreels shown in German cinemas. America, her instructors had assured her, was a nation on the brink of collapse, a country where bread lines stretched for blocks, where the wealthy hoarded food while ordinary citizens starved, where the illusion of plenty masked a desperate reality of scarcity and inequality. The propaganda films had shown hollow-eyed American children, empty store shelves, and crowds of unemployed workers fighting over scraps. This was the enemy she had been taught to fear and pity in equal measure. Now, as a prisoner of war bound for an internment camp somewhere in Wisconsin, Greta expected to find confirmation of everything she had been told. She clutched a small leather journal against her chest, the only personal possession she had been allowed to keep. Inside, she had written her mother's recipe for Kartoffelpuffer, potato pancakes, made with whatever meager ingredients could be scraped together in wartime Germany. It seemed foolish now to have preserved such a thing, but it was all she had left of home. Beside her stood Frida Lehmann, barely 21 years old, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much death in field hospitals near the front. Frida had not spoken much during the crossing, spending most of her time in her bunk, staring at the metal ceiling above her. Ilse Bauer, at 25 the oldest of their small group, maintained the rigid posture of her former administrative position, as if military bearing could somehow protect them from whatever awaited in this foreign land. The ship docked in New York Harbor on a gray morning that matched Greta's expectations perfectly. The city beyond looked imposing and industrial, its skyline shrouded in fog and smoke. This was the America she had been prepared to see, cold, mechanical, struggling beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The processing center was efficient and impersonal. American soldiers checked their papers, assigned them numbers, and loaded them onto trains heading west. Greta watched the landscape change through the train windows, expecting to see the devastation of a nation at war. Instead, she saw farms with full barns, towns with intact buildings, and rail yards stacked with goods. It confused her. Where was the suffering? Where were the signs of the collapse she had been promised? The other German women noticed it too. Quiet conversations in their native language revealed a shared bewilderment. Perhaps someone suggested they were being shown only the best areas, the way prisoners might be paraded past staged scenes designed to break their morale. Greta wrote in her journal that night as the train rolled through the darkness. America looks nothing like we were told, but appearances can be deceiving. We will see the truth soon enough. The prisoner of war camp sat 3 miles outside the small town of Richford, Wisconsin, surrounded by farmland that stretched toward distant tree lines. When the transport truck pulled through the gates on March 22, 1945, Greta's first impression was how temporary everything looked. Wooden barracks hastily constructed, chain-link fencing that seemed almost apologetic in its purpose, guard towers manned by young men who looked barely older than teenagers. This was nothing like the fortified compounds she had imagined. Captain Ruth Caldwell stood waiting as the German women filed off the truck, 47 prisoners in total, wearing a mixture of torn auxiliary uniforms and civilian clothes obtained during their journey. Captain Caldwell was a woman in her mid-30s with steel gray eyes and an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. She addressed them through a translator, outlining the camp rules in clear, measured tones. They would be housed in 2 barracks. They would work in various capacities to maintain the camp. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Any attempt to escape would result in solitary confinement. Greta listened to these words while studying the camp itself. The grounds were clean but sparse, utilitarian in design. What struck her most was the absence of visible deprivation. The guards looked well-fed and healthy. Their uniforms were intact and properly fitted. The buildings, though simple, appeared structurally sound. Where were the signs of American collapse? Sergeant Clifford Jensen, a tall man with Norwegian features and a Minnesota accent, escorted the women to their assigned barracks. He walked with a slight limp from an injury that had removed him from combat duty, and his manner was neither cruel nor particularly warm. He simply did his job with quiet efficiency. The barracks interior was stark but adequate. Metal frame beds lined the walls, each with a thin mattress, wool blanket, and pillow. A coal stove sat in the center for heating. The windows had bars but also curtains, a small detail that seemed oddly civilized. Frida claimed a bed near the stove and immediately lay down, exhausted from the journey. Ilsa began organizing her small bundle of possessions with the methodical precision she brought to every task. Greta stood at the window, looking out at the campgrounds and the farmland beyond. In the distance, she could see silos and barns painted a distinctive red. Smoke rose from the chimneys of farmhouses scattered across the landscape. Everything looked prosperous and peaceful, disturbingly so. That evening, they received their first meal in the camp mess hall. Greta had expected watery soup and hard bread, the kind of rations that matched her understanding of American scarcity. What appeared before her instead made her hands freeze above the tray. Thick slices of white bread. Real butter. Not the ersatz substitute she had grown accustomed to in Germany. A bowl of beef stew with actual chunks of meat visible in the broth. An apple, fresh and unblemished. She stared at the food as if it might be an illusion, some trick designed to humiliate them later. Greta sat at the long wooden table in the mess hall, the tray of food before her seeming to mock everything she had been taught about American deprivation. Around her, the other German women had fallen into confused silence, their eyes moving between their own trays and those of the American guards eating nearby. The portions were identical. There was no hierarchy of rations, no visible distinction between captor and captive when it came to the food itself. Frida leaned close and whispered in German, "Is this some kind of test? Are they waiting to see if we'll act like animals and devour it?" Ilsa, ever practical, picked up her spoon with deliberate composure. "If it's poisoned, we'll all die together with dignity," she said quietly, then took her first bite of the stew. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing, simply continued eating with measured bites. Greta lifted the slice of white bread, feeling its softness so different from the dense dark bread of wartime Germany. She had not seen butter like this in 2 years, yellow and creamy, spreading easily across the surface. The first bite dissolved on her tongue with a richness that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. This was not the food of a starving nation. This was not the desperate meal of a country on the brink of collapse. The beef stew was even more disorienting. Real meat, not the mysterious substitutes that had become standard in German rations. Carrots and potatoes cooked until tender, a broth that actually had flavor and substance. Greta ate slowly, trying to reconcile what she was experiencing with everything she believed she knew about America. Across the mess hall, Corporal Mildred Harding supervised the serving line with the efficiency of someone who had run institutional kitchens her entire adult life. She was a sturdy woman in her 40s with forearms strengthened by years of lifting heavy pots and kneading industrial quantities of dough. She watched the German women eat, with an expression that might have been satisfaction or perhaps just professional pride in her work. Private Howard Finch, who could not have been more than 19 years old, sat at a nearby table eating his own identical meal. He was a farm boy from Iowa with sun-bleached hair and the open face of someone who had never learned to hide his thoughts. Greta noticed him glancing at the German women with curiosity rather than hostility, as if they were simply new arrivals to be observed rather than enemies to be feared. When the meal ended, Greta returned to the barracks with the apple still in her pocket, unable to eat it. She sat on her bed and wrote in her journal with trembling hands. "They fed us like human beings today, real food, not scraps or punishment rations. I don't understand. Either everything we were told about America was a lie, or this is an elaborate deception. But why would they waste such food on prisoners if their own people are starving? Nothing makes sense anymore." The first week in the camp established a routine that further destabilized everything Greta thought she understood about America. Each morning began with roll call at 7 o'clock, followed by breakfast that continued to contradict her expectations. Oatmeal with brown sugar and milk, eggs, sometimes scrambled, sometimes fried, toast with jam, coffee that was actually coffee, not the bitter grain substitutes she had grown accustomed to in Germany. The portions never diminished. There were no signs of rationing or shortage. Work assignments came on the third day. Greta, with her language skills and education, was assigned to assist in the camp administration office. Frida, with her medical training, would work alongside the camp physician. Ilse was placed in the supply office, managing inventory and records. These were not the brutal labor assignments Greta had anticipated. They were practical positions that utilized their actual skills. In the administration office, Greta worked under the supervision of Sergeant Jensen, organizing files and translating documents related to prisoner records. The office was heated, clean, and equipped with functioning typewriters and adequate supplies. Jensen was a man of few words, but his instructions were clear, and he showed no particular hostility toward his German assistant. On her fourth day, while filing medical records, Greta made a discovery that shook her. The camp physician's reports showed comprehensive medical care for all prisoners, treatment that exceeded what many German civilians had access to during the war years. Dental care, treatments for minor ailments, even eyeglasses provided when needed. This was not how a collapsing nation treated its prisoners. That afternoon, during the work break, several German women gathered near the barracks to smoke the cigarettes provided in their weekly rations. Real tobacco, not the harsh substitutes they had known. The conversation turned inevitably to the cognitive dissonance they were all experiencing. "Perhaps this is a special camp," suggested one woman, a former clerk named Margaret. "Perhaps they show us this abundance while their own citizens suffer elsewhere." But Ilse shook her head. "I've seen the supply manifests. This camp receives standard military rations. There's no indication this is special treatment. This is simply how they feed their troops and their prisoners." Frida, who had been quiet for days, finally spoke. "In the infirmary, I've seen the medical supplies. They have sulfa drugs, morphine, proper bandages, everything we ran short of in our field hospitals months ago. The American medic told me these are standard issue." He seemed confused when I expressed surprise at having them available. Greta pulled out her journal and flipped through pages of observations she had been recording. Food quantities, material conditions, the health and appearance of American personnel. Every data point contradicted the narrative of American collapse and desperation she had been taught. The transformation in Greta's understanding accelerated in the second week when Corporal Mildred Harding requested additional help in the camp kitchen. 3 German women volunteered, including Greta, driven partly by curiosity and partly by the basic human desire to be near food preparation when hunger had been a constant companion for so long. The kitchen itself was a revelation. Industrial-sized refrigerators hummed with electricity, their interiors stocked with meat, dairy, and vegetables. Pantry shelves lined with canned goods, sacks of flour and sugar, containers of spices and seasonings. Greta stood in the doorway of the storage room, mentally calculating what she was seeing. This single camp kitchen held more food than her entire neighborhood in Hamburg had seen in the last year of the war. Corporal Harding was a no-nonsense woman who ran her kitchen with military precision, but without cruelty. She demonstrated techniques and expected them to be followed exactly. On Greta's first day, Harding was preparing the evening meal, and the main component made Greta stop in her tracks. Chicken. dozens of whole chickens, fresh and plump, waiting to be prepared. In Germany, chicken had become a luxury reserved for special occasions or the wealthy. Here it was apparently a routine weekday meal for a prison camp. "You ever fried chicken before?" Harding asked Greta through the camp, translator who had been brought in for kitchen instructions. Greta shook her head, staring at the pale birds. "We mostly boiled everything near the end, to conserve fuel, and because that's what worked with the rations we had." Harding nodded with something that might have been sympathy. "Well, you're about to learn the right way, American style." What followed was an education in abundance. Harding showed them how to cut the chickens into pieces, how to prepare a buttermilk marinade, how to mix flour with a complicated blend of spices that seemed extravagant in both variety and quantity: salt, pepper, paprika, garlic powder, onion powder, cayenne. Each chicken piece was dredged in the seasoned flour until completely coated. Then came the process that seemed most wasteful to Greta's wartime sensibilities. Harding filled large cast-iron skillets with what appeared to be an enormous amount of oil, heating it until it shimmered. "You want it hot enough that the chicken sizzles when it hits the pan," she explained. "That's how you get the crust crispy on the outside while the meat stays juicy inside." The chicken pieces went into the hot oil with a sound like rain on a tin roof. The smell that rose from those skillets was unlike anything Greta had experienced: rich, savory, complex with spices. Her mouth watered involuntarily. Around her, Frida and the other German volunteers had gone very quiet, watching this process with the intensity of people witnessing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Harding worked efficiently, turning each piece with tongs, adjusting the heat, adding more chicken as space allowed. The golden brown crust that formed seemed almost decorative in its perfection, nothing like the pale boiled meat Greta associated with poultry. As the first batch of fried chicken finished cooking, Corporal Harding lifted the pieces onto a wire rack, letting excess oil drip away. The kitchen filled with an aroma so overwhelming that Greta felt almost dizzy from it. This was not the smell of survival food or rations carefully stretched to feed as many mouths as possible. This was the smell of abundance transformed into pleasure, of cooking as something beyond mere sustenance. Harding noticed the German women watching with expressions that mixed hunger and confusion. Her weathered face softened slightly. "You girls look like you've never seen fried chicken before," she said, waiting for the translator to convey her words. "Where I come from in Tennessee, this is Sunday dinner. Nothing fancy, just home cooking." Just home cooking. Greta felt those words settle in her stomach like stones. This extravagant preparation, this generous use of oil and spices and electricity, this was considered ordinary. Not a feast or celebration, but a regular meal. What did that say about everything she had been taught regarding American poverty and desperation? Harding pulled out a piece of chicken and broke it open to check if it was cooked through. Steam rose from the white meat inside, juices running clear. She nodded with satisfaction, then surprised everyone by handing pieces to each of the German women working in the kitchen. "Can't learn to cook something if you don't know how it's supposed to taste," she said practically. "Go on, try it while it's hot." Greta held the piece of chicken breast, feeling the heat radiate through the crispy coating. She could see the layers of flour and spice clinging to the outside, golden and textured. The other women waited, looking to her as the informal leader of their group. She lifted the chicken to her mouth and took a bite. The crust shattered with an audible crunch, giving way to meat so tender and moist it seemed impossible. The spices bloomed on her tongue, complex and balanced, nothing like the harsh or flat flavors of wartime cooking. Fat and salt and the mysterious blend of seasonings created something that tasted simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. She chewed slowly, awareness dawning that this single piece of chicken represented a level of culinary care and material abundance that contradicted years of propaganda. Frida bit into her own piece and made a small sound of surprise. Tears formed in her eyes, though whether from the food itself or from what it represented, Greta could not say. The other German women ate in silence, each processing their own private reckoning with this simple meal. Harding watched them with an expression that held more understanding than she put into words. She had fed soldiers returning from Europe, had heard their stories about the conditions in Germany, the hunger and deprivation. She had some idea what this meal meant to women who had lived through years of rationing and scarcity. "There's plenty more where that came from," she said quietly. "You'll help me make enough for everyone tonight." The camp allowed prisoners to write letters home under supervision, with all correspondence reviewed by censors to ensure no sensitive information was shared. 2 weeks after her arrival, Greta sat in the barracks attempting to compose a letter to her mother in Hamburg, assuming the letter would even reach her through the chaos of defeated Germany. She had started and discarded 4 attempts, each time struggling with how to describe her experience without sounding insane. How could she explain that American prison camp meals were better than anything she had eaten in the last 2 years of the war? That the guards showed no particular cruelty? That the material conditions suggested not a nation on the brink of collapse, but one with resources to spare even for its enemies? Finally, she wrote in careful, measured language, "Dear Mama, I am well, and being treated according to international law. The conditions here are adequate, and we receive sufficient food. I think of you constantly and pray you are safe. The Americans are not what we were told to expect. I cannot explain more in a letter, but know that I am learning many things that surprise me. I hope this letter finds you alive and whole. Your daughter, Greta." It was bland and uninformative, but anything more specific would either be censored or sound like propaganda from the other side. How could she tell her mother that yesterday's lunch had included fresh bread, vegetable soup with actual vegetables, and slices of ham? That breakfast had featured pancakes with maple syrup, a sweetener she had only read about in books. Her mother, if she was still alive, was likely living on ration cards that provided barely enough calories to survive. Other women faced similar struggles with their correspondence. Ilse had written to her sister in Frankfurt 3 times, each letter sounding more distant and formal than the last. She confessed to Greta one evening that she feared telling the truth about conditions in the camp because it felt like a betrayal. "If I write that we eat chicken and fresh vegetables while they starve in the ruins of our cities, what does that make me? A traitor who enjoys comfort while Germany suffers?" Frida had received a letter from her aunt, the only family member she had been able to locate through Red Cross channels. The letter, dated 6 weeks earlier, described conditions in Stuttgart with clinical brevity. Entire neighborhoods destroyed by bombing, food queues that started before dawn for bread rations that often ran out before everyone could be served, her cousin's children showing signs of malnutrition. The casual mention of death had become so common it no longer warranted emotional language. Frida read portions of the letter aloud to Greta and Ilse in quiet German. When she finished, she set the thin paper down on her bunk and said, "We ate fried chicken last week. Fried chicken, while my cousin's children are starving." The guilt was palpable in the barracks that evening, a collective weight that pressed down on all of them. They were being fed better as prisoners than their families were as free citizens in their own country. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. Everything they had believed about American weakness and German superiority was being dismantled one meal at a time. By the end of April 1945, something disturbing was happening to Greta's perception. The abundance that had shocked her during the first weeks was becoming ordinary. She no longer stared at the portions on her breakfast tray or mentally calculated the value of ingredients used in each meal. The transformation happened so gradually she barely noticed until one morning when she caught herself leaving food on her plate, something unthinkable just a month earlier. The realization struck her with uncomfortable force. She had become accustomed to plenty. Her body, which had spent years in a state of constant mild hunger, had adjusted to regular, adequate nutrition. Her uniforms, which had hung loose when she arrived, now fit properly. Her skin had lost the grayish pallor of malnutrition. Even her hair seemed healthier, thicker. She was not alone in this transformation. The other German women were showing similar changes. They moved with more energy, spoke with stronger voices, and had begun to show individual personalities that hunger and exhaustion had previously suppressed. Frida had started smiling occasionally, a rare sight that made her look younger than her 21 years. Ilse had revealed an unexpected sense of humor during their work shifts. The camp routine had become familiar, almost comfortable. Morning roll call, breakfast, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, and evening hours of relative freedom in the barracks or recreation yard. The guards no longer watched them with the same careful vigilance. Sergeant Jensen had begun teaching Greta more complex administrative tasks, trusting her with filing systems and correspondence. Private Finch, the young farm boy from Iowa, had struck up tentative conversations with several of the German women during breaks, his curiosity about their lives outweighing any sense of them as enemies. He told them about his family's dairy farm, about his 3 sisters, about the cornfields that stretched to the horizon back home. In return, the women shared carefully edited versions of their own backgrounds, finding common ground in descriptions of rural life and family traditions. One afternoon in the kitchen, while helping Corporal Harding prepare dinner, Greta realized she was humming. The awareness stopped her cold. She was humming while working in an American prison camp kitchen, comfortable and well-fed, while her mother might be starving in the ruins of Hamburg. The guilt crashed over her like a physical weight. Harding noticed the sudden stillness and the expression on Greta's face. The older woman paused in her work, studying the German woman with shrewd eyes. "You're feeling bad about being okay here," she said, through the translator who had become a fixture in the kitchen during training sessions. "Feeling guilty because you got food in your belly and a roof over your head while folks back home are suffering." Greta nodded, unable to speak. Harding wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter. "Listen, girl. You didn't start this war. You don't control what's happening back in Germany. Right now you're here, and being miserable won't help anybody back home. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people you love is to survive and be healthy enough to help them when you get the chance." The first week of May brought news that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Captain Caldwell announced it during morning roll call, her voice neutral and professional. But the American guards could not entirely suppress their relief and quiet celebration. For the German women, the announcement landed with complicated weight. Their country had been defeated. Everything they had served and believed in had failed. Yet standing in an American prison camp, well-fed and adequately housed, many of them felt a shameful sense of relief that the fighting had finally ended. That evening, Captain Caldwell made an unusual decision. She arranged for a film projector to be set up in the mess hall and announced that all prisoners were required to attend a screening. The German women filed in with apprehension, unsure what they were about to witness. The newsreels began with Allied troops advancing through Germany, liberating territory, and encountering scenes that would haunt Greta for the rest of her life. The images were grainy, black and white, but their content was unmistakable. Concentration camps, piles of emaciated bodies, living skeletons in striped uniforms staring at cameras with hollow eyes, mass graves, gas chambers, systematic documentation of industrial-scale murder, the mess hall filled with the sound of German women crying, gasping, some running outside to vomit. Greta sat frozen in her seat, unable to look away from the screen, even as her mind rebelled against what she was seeing. This could not be real. This could not be Germany. This could not be what she had served, what she had believed in. But the evidence was undeniable. American soldiers, British soldiers, Soviet soldiers, all discovering the same horrors in different locations. The camps had names that meant nothing to Greta until that moment. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. The narration described what had been found, the scale of the atrocities, the systematic nature of the killings. Millions dead, millions murdered for being Jewish, for being Roma, for being disabled, for being different. Frida fled the room halfway through, unable to watch any more. Ilse sat with her hands pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Around them, other German women were having similar reactions, the horror and disbelief playing out in gasps and sobs and stunned silence. When the newsreels ended, Captain Caldwell stood before them and spoke without the translator, though her words were simple enough for most of them to understand. This is what you were part of. This is what your country did. You may not have known, you may not have participated directly, but this is the truth you must face. The walk back to the barracks happened in near silence. Inside, women sat on their bunks or stood at windows, unable to process what they had witnessed. Greta opened her journal, but found herself unable to write. What words could possibly capture this? How could she reconcile the young woman who had proudly served in the Women's Auxiliary Corps with the knowledge that her service had been part of a system that committed such horrors? That night, very few women slept. The days following the newsreel screening passed in a fog of collective grief and confusion. The German women moved through their routines mechanically, their earlier adjustment to camp life, disrupted by the weight of knowledge they could not escape. Conversations became quieter, more hesitant. Even simple interactions with American guards carried new awkwardness, as both sides processed what the revelations meant for their relationship. Greta found herself unable to meet Sergeant Jensen's eyes during work shifts. How could she face him knowing what Germany had done? How could any of them claim ignorance when the evidence was so overwhelming? Yet Jensen treated her no differently than before, still assigning her tasks with the same quiet efficiency, still correcting her mistakes without hostility. Private Finch, who had been friendly with several of the German women, seemed unsure how to navigate the changed atmosphere. He still nodded greetings, but kept more distance, as if uncertain whether kindness toward them was appropriate now. Only Corporal Harding seemed unchanged in the kitchen. She continued teaching cooking techniques with the same practical focus, neither punishing the German women with coldness nor offering excessive sympathy. Her consistency became strangely comforting. 2 weeks after the screening, Captain Caldwell called another assembly. The German women gathered with apprehension, fearing more newsreels or perhaps announcements about repatriation to the devastated homeland they no longer recognized. Instead, Caldwell announced something unexpected. In November, Americans celebrate Thanksgiving, a holiday about gratitude and coming together over a shared meal. This year, Thanksgiving will fall on November 22nd. I've decided that this camp will observe the holiday properly, and all prisoners will participate in both the preparation and the meal itself. The announcement was met with confused silence. Why would the Americans share their holiday with German prisoners, especially now, after everything that had been revealed? Caldwell continued. I know what you saw in those newsreels. I know what you're feeling, but I also believe that people can change, that understanding can grow, and that breaking bread together is how enemies become something else. Over the following weeks, preparations for Thanksgiving became a collective project. Corporal Harding increased the number of German women working in the kitchen, teaching them traditional American holiday dishes. Turkey, a bird Greta had only seen in photographs, arrived frozen and enormous. Harding demonstrated how to thaw it safely, how to prepare stuffing from cornbread and herbs, how to make gravy from pan drippings. She showed them cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green bean casserole, and pumpkin pie. Each dish seemed more excessive and elaborate than the last. Greta worked alongside Frida and Ilse, following Harding's instructions while trying to understand this strange ritual. The Americans were celebrating abundance by sharing it, even with prisoners, even with the defeated enemy. It contradicted everything she thought she knew about how victors treated the vanquished. The holiday arrived with unseasonably warm weather for late November. Thanksgiving morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the barracks windows. Greta woke early, her mind already turning over the contradictions that had become her daily reality. Today she would help prepare a feast for her captors, sharing in an American tradition while her own country lay in ruins and her mother's fate remained unknown. The kitchen bustled with activity by 6 in the morning. Corporal Harding had enlisted a dozen German women to help with the massive meal preparation. The turkeys, 3 of them to feed the entire camp population, went into the ovens first. Harding demonstrated the basting technique, opening the oven door periodically to spoon pan juices over the browning birds. The smell that filled the kitchen was rich and savory, making Greta's mouth water despite her conflicted feelings. Frida worked on peeling potatoes, an enormous mound of them that would be boiled and mashed with butter and cream. Real cream, not the watery substitute Greta remembered from Germany. Ilse learned to make cranberry sauce from fresh berries, sugar, and orange zest, following Harding's instructions with her characteristic precision. As the morning progressed, the kitchen became warmer and more fragrant, sweet potatoes baking in their skins, onions caramelizing for the green bean casserole, pumpkin pie filling, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, poured into flaky crusts. Each component represented abundance, ingredients used generously rather than stretched or substituted. Private Finch appeared in the kitchen doorway around mid-morning, drawn by the smells. "Corporal Harding, it smells like home in here," he said, his young face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Reminds me of my ma's kitchen on Thanksgiving." Harding smiled, one of her rare expressions of warmth. "That's the idea, Private. That's exactly the idea." She turned to the German women working around her. "Thanksgiving is about remembering what you're grateful for, even in hard times, especially in hard times. My grandparents came to America with nothing, fleeing hard situations in their own countries. They started this tradition of cooking a big meal once a year to remind themselves they had made it to somewhere better." Greta paused in her work, considering these words. Harding's grandparents had been immigrants, displaced people who had fled to America seeking better lives. Not so different from what the German women might face now, returning to a destroyed homeland or trying to build new lives elsewhere. The parallel was uncomfortable but undeniable. By early afternoon, the meal was ready. The mess hall had been transformed with tablecloths and makeshift decorations. American guards and German prisoners filed in together, taking seats at long tables arranged differently than usual. Instead of the typical separation between captors and captives, the seating was mixed. Greta found herself sitting between Sergeant Jensen and another German woman named Kata. The turkeys were carved and served alongside the various side dishes, plates piled high with food in quantities that still seemed excessive to Greta's wartime sensibilities. Captain Caldwell stood to address the assembled group before anyone began eating. "Today we share a meal that represents hope and possibility," she said. The Thanksgiving meal progressed with an atmosphere that felt surreal to Greta. Americans and Germans passing dishes to one another, making stilted attempts at conversation across language barriers, sharing food that would have fed a German family for a week. She ate mechanically, tasting without really experiencing, her mind too busy processing the strangeness of sitting at a table with her former enemies as something approaching equals. Sergeant Jensen noticed her distraction. Through a combination of his limited German and her improving English, he asked if the food was acceptable. Greta nodded, then surprised herself by asking a question that had been bothering her for weeks. "Why do you treat us this way? After what you showed us, what Germany did, why feed us like honored guests?" Jensen considered the question seriously before responding in his slow, careful English, simplified so she could understand. "My family came from Norway 3 generations back. They fled because they were starving and had no future there. America gave them a chance to be something better than what they were born to be. Maybe that's what America does best, giving people chances to be better." The answer did not satisfy all of Greta's confusion, but it gave her something to think about. Around the table, similar conversations were happening in fragmented English and German, both sides trying to bridge gaps that just months ago had seemed unbridgeable. After the meal, Corporal Harding announced that she would teach anyone interested how to bake traditional American pies over the coming weeks. To Greta's surprise, nearly every German woman in the camp volunteered. The pie-making lessons became regular events in the kitchen, sessions where Harding taught the precise techniques for creating flaky crusts and perfectly spiced fillings. Apple pie, cherry pie, pecan pie, each with its own specific requirements and traditions. Greta discovered she had an aptitude for pastry, her careful hands well suited to the delicate work of rolling dough and crimping edges. During these sessions, something unexpected emerged. The German women began sharing their own recipes, describing dishes from their regions and families. Greta taught Harding how to make her mother's Kartoffelpuffer, translating measurements and techniques. Frida demonstrated Spätzle, the tiny dumplings her grandmother had made every Sunday. Ilse shared her aunt's recipe for Sauerbraten, though she noted ruefully that the ingredient list would be impossible to source in current-day Germany. Harding listened with genuine interest, sometimes taking notes, asking questions about techniques and regional variations. "Food is food," she said one afternoon. "Doesn't matter what country it comes from. Good cooking is good cooking, and recipes are how we remember where we came from." The exchange of recipes became a form of cultural diplomacy, a way for the German women to offer something of value in return for what they had received. They could not change what Germany had done, could not undo the horrors revealed in those newsreels, but they could share this small piece of their heritage. The kitchen became a neutral ground, where nationality mattered less than technique, where the language of cooking transcended the barriers of German and English. December brought cold weather and news that repatriation procedures were beginning for German prisoners of war across America. Captain Caldwell received orders from the War Department outlining the process. German nationals would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes and families. The announcement came during morning roll call on December 7, 1945. The date carried its own significance, exactly 4 years after Pearl Harbor, the event that had brought America into the war. Caldwell stood before the assembled German women and read the official orders in her clear professional voice. Transportation would be arranged beginning in January. They would have 6 weeks to prepare for departure. The reaction among the German women was complicated. Relief that a decision had been made, that the uncertainty would end. Fear about what they would return to in devastated Germany. Guilt about leaving the relative comfort and security they had found in American captivity. That evening in the barracks, the conversations revealed the depth of their conflicted feelings. Some women were eager to return, desperate to search for family members and begin the work of rebuilding their country. Others dreaded going back to face the judgment of fellow Germans who might see their time in American camps as collaboration or betrayal. Greta sat on her bunk writing in her journal, trying to articulate thoughts that remained stubbornly unclear. She had learned so much in these months, about America, about Germany, about herself. The propaganda she had believed had been thoroughly dismantled by the simple reality of American abundance and unexpected kindness. But what did that knowledge mean for her future? Could she return to Hamburg and simply resume her life, pretending these months had not fundamentally changed how she saw the world? Frida approached her bunk that evening, her young face showing the strain of the decision ahead. "I don't want to go back," she whispered in German. "Is that terrible? Does that make me a traitor?" Greta set down her journal and looked at her friend. "I don't know what it makes us. I only know that nothing is simple anymore." Over the following days, the German women began sorting through what few possessions they had accumulated. Letters from home, when they came, painted grim pictures of conditions in Germany. Cities remained largely in ruins, Food was scarce. The occupation forces controlled all aspects of daily life. The economic system had collapsed. Former Nazi Party members faced denazification proceedings. Women were working in rubble crews, clearing destroyed buildings brick by brick. It was into this reality that they would be returning. Yet the alternative was unclear. They were prisoners of war, not immigrants. They had no legal right to remain in America beyond their captivity. The Geneva Convention required their repatriation. Unless something changed, unless some exception could be made, they would be going home, whether they wanted to or not. Christmas of 1945 approached it with a heaviness that contrasted sharply with the previous year's tentative celebrations. The German women now knew they would be leaving soon, returning to a homeland many no longer recognized or wanted to face. The barracks conversations grew more intense as women debated privately what they truly wanted versus what duty demanded. Greta found herself increasingly torn. Her mother, if still alive, would be struggling to survive in bombed-out Hamburg. Every moral obligation pointed toward returning to help her family and contribute to Germany's rebuilding. Yet the thought of leaving the safety and unexpected community she had found in this American camp filled her with a dread she could barely acknowledge. On December 20th, Captain Caldwell called Greta to her office. The summons was unusual enough to spark anxiety. Greta entered to find Caldwell seated behind her desk with several documents spread before her. "Sit down, Greta," Caldwell said, using her first name rather than her surname, another unusual choice. "I want to discuss something with you." Greta sat, hands folded in her lap, waiting. Caldwell studied her for a moment before speaking. "You've been an exemplary prisoner. Your work in administration has been invaluable, and you've served as a bridge between the German women and the American staff. Sergeant Jensen speaks highly of your abilities. Corporal Harding says you're her best kitchen assistant." Greta nodded, unsure where this was leading. Caldwell continued, "The War Department has authorized a small program for exceptional cases. German prisoners with specific skills who have demonstrated clear rejection of Nazi ideology and genuine integration can apply for displaced person status rather than immediate repatriation. It's a narrow window, very few will qualify, but I'm offering you the opportunity to apply." The words hung in the air like something impossible. Stay in America, not as a prisoner, but as a displaced person with potential path to immigration. Rebuild her life. Here, rather than in the ruins of Germany, Greta felt her throat tighten. "My mother," she managed to say in her careful English, "I have responsibility to family." Caldwell nodded. "I understand. That's why I'm giving you time to think about it. You have 2 weeks before repatriation transport arrives. The decision is entirely yours." Greta left the office in a daze. Back in the barracks, she found Frida and Ilse, and told them about Caldwell's offer in hushed German. Both women looked at her with expressions mixing hope and envy. "You should do it," Frida said immediately. "You have the language skills, the education. You could build a good life here." Ilse was more cautious. "But what about your mother? Could you live with yourself if you stayed while she struggles alone in Hamburg?" The question haunted Greta through the following days. She had written another letter home, but received no response. She had no way of knowing if her mother was even alive, if the apartment building still stood, if any of her family had survived the final months of the war and the chaos that followed. Yet choosing to stay in America based on that uncertainty felt like choosing comfort over duty, abundance over loyalty. Word spread through the camp that some German women might be allowed to stay. The news created divisions among the prisoners. Some were bitter that only a few would receive such opportunities. Others were relieved that at least some could escape the fate awaiting them in Germany. 5 women total were offered the displaced person option by Captain Caldwell. Along with Greta, Frida received an offer based on her medical skills and work with the camp physician. Ilse was selected for her administrative abilities. 2 others, women who had worked in various capacities and demonstrated similar commitment and skills, were also approached. The decision deadline approached rapidly. Greta spent hours walking the camp perimeter, wrestling with questions that had no clear answers. Was it selfish to stay? Was it stupid to return? Could she honor her mother's memory and sacrifices by building a life in America? Or would that be the ultimate betrayal? Private Finch found her during one of these walks. His English was simple enough for her to understand without a translator now. "You thinking about staying or going?" he asked directly. Greta nodded. "It's a hard choice," he said. "My dad had to make a similar one back in 1920. His family in Ireland was struggling, needed help, but he'd found work in America, met my mother. He chose to stay and send money back instead of returning. He always wondered if he made the right choice." He paused, looking across the frozen fields. "But he fed his family better from here than he could have from there." Sometimes the best way to help people you love is to become strong enough to actually help them. The words resonated with something Greta had been avoiding. If she returned to Hamburg with nothing, she would simply be another mouth to feed, another person struggling in the ruins. If she stayed in America, built a career with her language skills, perhaps she could eventually send money, resources, actual material help to her family. It was not a comfortable rationalization, but it had practical truth. 2 days before the deadline, a letter finally arrived from Hamburg. Greta's hands shook as she opened it. Her mother's handwriting, still recognizable despite the shakiness suggesting poor health or malnutrition. The letter was brief and factual. The apartment building had been destroyed. She was living with distant relatives in a suburb that had been less damaged. Food was scarce, but she was surviving. Her father had died in 1943. Her brother was missing, presumed killed on the Eastern Front. The letter concluded with unexpected words. "Do not feel obligated to return if opportunity exists elsewhere. Germany has nothing to offer you now but suffering. I raised you to be strong and intelligent. Use those gifts wherever you can use them best. I will manage. I have survived this much already." Greta read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Her mother was giving her permission to choose her own path, even if that path led away from family duty. That evening, Greta informed Captain Caldwell of her decision. She would apply for displaced person status. She would stay. January 15, 1946. Arrived with bitter cold and heavy snowfall. The transport trucks that would take most of the German women to the port in New York sat idling outside the camp gates, their engines running to keep warm. 42 women would be leaving today, returning to whatever remained of their homeland. 5 would be staying behind, beginning the complicated process of transitioning from prisoners of war to displaced persons seeking immigration status. The farewell scene in the barracks was emotional in ways that surprised everyone. Women who had been strangers 8 months ago, thrown together by the accident of capture and imprisonment, had become something closer to family. They had shared the journey from enemies to something more complex and human. Greta embraced women whose names she had barely known, feeling the weight of diverging paths. Those who were leaving carried letters and small gifts, tokens of their time in American captivity. Several had recipes written carefully in German, dishes they planned to make if ingredients ever became available again in Germany. Others carried photographs taken by sympathetic guards, images of themselves looking healthier than they had in years. Some carried addresses of American families who had promised to send care packages once regular mail service resumed. The women who were staying stood apart, watching the departure preparations with mixed emotions. Relief that they would not be facing the devastation of Germany, guilt that they were choosing the easier path, hope that this choice would lead to genuine new beginnings. Corporal Harding appeared with packages for each departing woman. "Sandwiches for the journey," she said gruffly. "Can't have you going hungry on the way to the ship." The sandwiches were thick with ham and cheese, wrapped carefully in waxed paper. Such simple kindness, food for a journey, but it represented everything about American abundance that had transformed these women's understanding of the world. Captain Caldwell addressed the departing women one final time, speaking through a translator, though many of them understood her English by now. "You came here as enemies. You leave as human beings who have been given the chance to see that former enemies can become something else. I hope you carry that lesson back to Germany. I hope you build lives that honor what you learned here." The trucks pulled away in the late morning, disappearing down the snow-covered road. Greta stood watching until they were completely out of sight, aware that she had just watched her last direct connection to Germany drive away. She was choosing America now, whatever that would mean. The 5 remaining women returned to their barracks to find that their status had already changed. They were no longer housed in the prisoner section, but moved to a small building near the administrative offices. No more guards watching their movements. No more roll calls. They were displaced persons now, technically free but practically dependent on the camp's continued support while they navigated immigration procedures. The transition from prisoner to displaced person proved more complicated than Greta anticipated. Immigration paperwork required sponsors, proof of employment prospects, character references, and endless forms documenting her history and qualifications. Captain Caldwell connected her with the Brennan family, Lucille and Chester, who owned a small restaurant in downtown Richford. They had heard about the German women through church groups and offered to sponsor Greta's immigration application. The Brennans were in their 50s, childless, and devoted to their modest establishment that served simple American fare to local farmers and townspeople. When Greta met them for the first time in February 1946, Lucille studied her with shrewd but kind eyes. "Captain Caldwell says you learned to cook in the camp kitchen. Says Mildred Harding thinks highly of your skills." Greta nodded nervously. "Corporal Harding taught me American cooking, fried chicken, pies, traditional dishes." Chester spoke for the first time. "We need help in the kitchen. Our regular cook left to take care of her sick mother. If you're willing to work and learn, we're willing to sponsor your immigration and provide room and board above the restaurant." It was more than Greta had dared hope for. Employment, housing, and the crucial sponsorship that would allow her to remain in America legally. She accepted immediately. By March, her immigration status was approved. She moved into a small apartment above the Brennan's restaurant, a single room with a bed, table, and window overlooking Main Street. It was more space than she had to herself in years. Working in the restaurant kitchen was different from the camp kitchen. Faster pace, more variety, customers with specific preferences and complaints. But the fundamental skills Corporal Harding had taught her proved invaluable. Greta could fry chicken until the crust was perfectly crispy. She could make flaky pie crusts and properly seasoned gravy. She learned the rhythms of breakfast rushes and dinner services. The townspeople of Richford were curious about the German woman working at Brennan's. Some were welcoming, others coldly polite, a few openly hostile. Greta understood their suspicion. The war was barely over. Many of these families had sons who fought in Europe. She kept her head down and focused on her work, letting her cooking speak for itself. Gradually, acceptance came. Her fried chicken became locally famous. Some claimed better than Lucille's original recipe. Her apple pies sold out regularly. Customers who had initially avoided the restaurant returned, drawn by food that was simply too good to resist regardless of who made it. Frida found work at the local hospital, her medical training filling a desperate need for qualified nurses. Ilse secured a position with a law firm, managing their administrative offices. The 3 women maintained close friendship, meeting weekly to share meals and speak German together, maintaining connection to what they had been while building what they were becoming. By summer, Greta had saved enough money to send her first package to her mother in Hamburg. 20 years later, in 1966, Greta stood in the kitchen of her own restaurant in Madison, Wisconsin. She had purchased the establishment 5 years earlier with savings carefully accumulated over 2 decades of work. The menu featured both American classics and German specialties, a culinary bridge between her 2 identities. Her fried chicken remained the signature dish, prepared exactly as Corporal Mildred Harding had taught her in that prison camp kitchen so many years ago. She had never forgotten the woman who showed her that food could be an act of reconciliation, that teaching someone to cook was a way of saying they deserved dignity and a future. Her mother had survived the difficult post-war years and eventually joined Greta in America in 1952, living her final decade in comfort her daughter provided. Frida had become head nurse at Madison General Hospital, married to an American doctor, raising 3 children who spoke English primarily but understood their mother's German heritage. Ilse ran her own accounting firm, financially successful and respected in the business community. They still gathered monthly, 3 former prisoners of war who had chosen America and built lives that honored both, where they came from and where they had landed. On this particular evening, a young woman entered Greta's restaurant with a notebook and recording device. She was a graduate student researching immigrant experiences and had heard about Greta's unusual story. Over coffee and apple pie, Greta told her about that first meal in the camp, the fried chicken that challenged everything she believed about America and about enemies. "One meal changed how I saw the world," Greta said in English, that retained only the slightest German accent after 20 years. Not because the food was good, though it was, but because it showed me that everything I had been taught was a lie. Americans were supposed to be weak and starving. Instead, they fed their prisoners better than we had fed ourselves. That generosity, that unexpected kindness, it broke something in me that needed to be broken. The young researcher asked if Greta ever regretted her choice to stay rather than return to Germany. Greta considered the question seriously. "I think about the roads not taken, but I also think about the life I built here, the family I helped, the people I fed. Corporal Harding taught me that food is how we say we see someone's humanity. Every meal I serve, I try to honor that lesson." The interview concluded as dinner service began. Greta returned to her kitchen, surrounded by the sounds and smells that had become her life's work. She thought about that nervous young woman who had bitten into fried chicken for the first time and discovered that abundance was real, that former enemies could show unexpected kindness, that choosing a different path did not mean betraying where you came from. It meant honoring what you learned along the way. The legacy of a single meal rippled forward through decades, through thousands of meals served with the same principle. Everyone deserves to be fed with dignity. Everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves to discover that the world is more complicated and more generous than propaganda claims.